Hi, I'm Mark, the transport guy. Now, on this channel moving forward, we're going to break down transport systems from Barbados to Europe to North America, looking at roads and buses and trains and airports, and just trying to figure out how do they really work. In each episode, I'm going to dive into one place, one problem, and the decisions that shape how people really move. So let's go. So the first thing we're going to do is to locate ourselves and understand the geography. We are going to start in Barbados. Then we're going to meet the people who are going to be using this junction every day. Next, and finally, we are going to ask a couple of questions. Is congestion actually inevitable, or can the way that we travel influence the outcome? And then I will apply the transport guy resilience index. So let's see how we get on. Grantley Adams International Airport. On average, about 2.4 million people arrive here every year. Some are visitors. Some are Bajans actually returning back home. Now, the airport sits in the southeast of the island, and hundreds of thousands of journeys start and end here. To the west of the airport is the Tom Adams Roundabout. For visitors, this is often the first road junction that you're going to experience when you come to Barbados. For Bajans, though, it is just part of everyday life. And at certain times of the week, it becomes one of the most pressured pieces of road on the island. This roundabout is really important, though, because it connects the airport to Oistins, it connects us to the ABC highway, and also to the wider Bridgetown, Wildy, and Warrens corridors. So it's an essential piece of infrastructure on our network. Importantly, this junction handles a mix of traffic. So we have airport traffic, local community traffic, island-wide journeys, and all of these flows collide at the same point. And this is one of the reasons why congestion often appears here. And when you couple those reasons with the layout of the link, which features bus stops and pedestrian crossings, there's always going to be challenge. But traffic is never just about roads, it's about people. And to understand how this junction works, we're going to follow a group of characters. Now look, they are fictional, but the journeys that they represent are very real. These are the transport guy personas. So let me introduce Trisha. She's a teacher, and she finishes work around 2:15 and heads home along the ABC highway. She's moving towards St. Philip because she lives in Ruby. And most afternoons, she is going to pass through this roundabout. Then there's Oliver. Oliver is visiting Barbados. He stayed at the Accra Hotel, and today he's returning his rental car before catching his flight back to London on Virgin Atlantic. There is Felicia. She lives in the Ivy, but she works at the airport. And today, she's actually coming around St. David's, and she is starting to run a little bit late. Meet Patsy. Patsy is the grandmother in our story. She lives nearby in Charnock's, and it is Wednesday afternoon. And she's beginning to leave home, and she's got to go and pick up the kids from St. Martin's Mangrove because they're going to stay with her for the afternoon. But before she does that, she needs to stop at Sol to get some gas. There are two types of visitors in our story. We've got Hannah and Caroline. They are arriving in Barbados for the first time, excited. They've just landed. They've picked up their rental car, and they are now navigating the Tom Adams Roundabout on their way to their Airbnb in Mangrove. Now, separate to them, there is Keith and Heather. They're regular visitors to Barbados. They know the island well, and they've got some friends who've bought a house over in Corvelly. And today they are traveling against the main traffic flow. But they know it. They know that they're going to come back in this in 2 weeks' time when they're leaving. Then we have Orville. Orville is from Church Village. And he's heading down to Miami Beach in Oistins. Now, for Orville, this congestion that he hears people talking about on brass tacks, he doesn't quite understand it because it really appears he is traveling in the opposite direction. And that's often something that can happen with people in congestion stories. Then we have Winston. Winston is an airport worker, and he is responsible for moving the flight crews between the airport and the Crane Hotel. And finally, we have Maureen. Maureen also works at the airport, but today is her day off, and she is taking the bus to 6 Roads because she's got a doctor's appointment. And she too is now starting to run a little bit late. So there you have it. 9 journeys, 9 perspectives, all meeting at the same piece of road. Now they'll meet at one location, the Tom Adams Roundabout. So here comes Trisha on our way through to Ruby. She will come through here. Oliver, as he hurries to the airport to drop off, he too will come through here. Now Felicia is starting to think of what is she going to say about her lateness on this particular occasion. Patsy sees this and maybe she's thinking, I could have left a little bit earlier today. Now, of course, Hannah and Caroline will be excited to be at Barbados. They're crawling through Tom Adams Roundabout, but they're not feeling it too much, and neither is Heather and Keith. As I said, for Orville, it's a breeze, no problem. He's going in the opposite direction. And of course, Winston has explained it all before, so there's nothing new to say. Now, Maureen is on the bus, and she's hoping that Dr. Musai will still see her because she is now really running late. These are some of the real challenges that people experience when they are caught in congestion. It's real. But when is this happening? Well, there are 2 moments in the week. Wednesdays at 2:40 and Saturdays at 3 o'clock. These are the busiest periods for this particular junction. And of course, you've got to ask yourself, why? Well, because we have multiple travel patterns overlapping. We have school pickup, we've got airport shifts, we've got people heading to the South Coast, and we've got island-wide travel coming from the Tom Adams. And of course, journeys heading towards Wilby and Bridgetown. They all are converging here, and the roundabout very quickly becomes a pressure point on the network. Okay, let's step back for a moment, and let's put Barbados in context, because I think that this is really important. Take Heathrow Airport in London, just as an example. And just go with me here for a moment, okay? Last year, Heathrow handled 84 million passengers. And that is seriously busy. And we know that Heathrow isn't just, Europe's busiest airport. It's one of the busiest in the world. But when you get to that scale, the pressure doesn't just sit at the airport. It starts to spill into the transport system. So in the case of Heathrow, you've got the busy roads like the M4, the M25. And of course, you've got your airport traffic, you've got your local traffic, you've got your long distance traffic, and they're all mixing together around Heathrow Airport. Now, that pressure builds, and that pressure has pushed a conversation. And that conversation has been about bigger and bigger infrastructure solutions. So here we are now looking at a 3rd runway for Heathrow Airport. That's on the cards. Now, even proposals to reroute the M25 in London will be part of this 3rd runway because it is going to be such a significant piece of infrastructure improvement. What I'm saying is, in other words, when demand keeps growing, the transport system keeps expanding to keep up. Now, if we come back to Barbados for a moment, now Barbados is obviously very different, and we don't have Heathrow's scale, and we certainly don't have Heathrow's land. What I know is on a small island, every acre matters. So we don't simply have that luxury of going on an endless road building program. But let's go elsewhere for a moment. Let's go to Aruba in the Caribbean, because this is probably a more fairer comparison, where Queen Beatrix Airport in Aruba Last year, they handled 3 million passengers. So they're right within that 5 million threshold of smaller airports, just like Grantley Adams. So it's probably a fairer comparison. However, if you look at how the access to this airport works, it is along a large, long connected corridor. What they haven't done is to force all of their airport traffic, local traffic, and long distance traffic into a single large junction. And of course, it's a different structure, but it is very comparable to what we have at Grantley Adams. If you want to look at another airport in the region where, how does this mix work and where does it potentially work better? But let's come back to Barbados again, because I believe that Barbados sits somewhere between these two stories. Obviously, we're not a Heathrow, but we're probably not completely a Queen Beatrix either. But demand is going to grow. Hopefully, tourism is going to grow. We know for sure that travel will continue to grow. But on our small network and with our limited land, even if we were to change the general arrangements for access, like I'm showing here at the Grantley Adams, we could do a few configuration changes to separate out the traffic. The real question still remains though, how do we manage that demand before the network starts to force us to answer more significant questions later on? So that brings us to demand management. And we transport planners like to talk about demand management because it's a key principle in influencing how people travel and behave in the transport system. Now, when you're in a situation like Barbados, where you've got 180,000 vehicles on a very small, congested network, we don't really have too much choice but to think about demand management. It is true that there are going to be some capacity improvements that will be required, but the game in town immediately is managing the demand for the network. So in demand management, we talk about the 5 R's. And that's all about retime, reroute, remode, reduce, or ultimately remove a journey from the network. And in the case of our story, where we had Trisha, there's a retime conversation that we can have there to look at travel in a different time. But in Barbados, we now need to have that conversation with schools and employers so that there is greater opportunity to be able to take advantage of retiming. So we've got to get there. Now, in the case of Orville on our network, Orville can reroute. He doesn't have to go through the Tom Adams to go to Oistins. There are alternative routes for people to take. And once people start to do this at scale, it becomes more effective. Now, in our story, Maureen chose to remote onto bus. And when people remote onto bus, it can be often challenging because buses get caught in the same congestion. But the more people who come out of vehicles who remote to bus, it then provides the opportunity for buses to become more efficient and run to their schedule. And then, of course, there is the need to reduce, where Felicia might be going to work or she might be coming from work and she can trip chain or she can go to the supermarket, she can go and do some errands, and you couple those things together. And ultimately, there are some journeys that we don't want to take or don't need to take and can remove them from the network. This is becoming even more essential now as we get to that stage where energy prices are high, gas is costing a lot more. So we've got to become a lot more efficient in how we choose to access the network and what we choose to do when we go on to the network. Now, for each deep dive, we're going to conduct something called the Transport Guy Index. It's a little bit of a scorecard that I've developed for this series because I think it's important to assess locations when we're considering them on the deep dive. And I'm going to look at this from 5 core metrics: network redundancy, operational flexibility, system reliability, access and connectivity, and climate resilience. And let me briefly explain each one of them. Now, when we talk about network redundancy, when we look at the Tom Adams, it's all about, well, what are the alternatives that we have? Are there other ways to get into the airport and away from the airport? For example, if there was an incident or some kind of big disaster, that is how we will score that particular one. Then there's operational flexibility. Now, this is all about how it adapts. And in the case of the Tom Adams, it doesn't adapt very well, actually, because it will either just distribute traffic around the circulatory of the roundabout, or it will lock up and get slow when it's congested. There's no adaptive control there. There's no traffic signals there ready to look at the volume of traffic and respond based on the time of day and what the network is experiencing. So it won't score very well in that particular context. Then there's system reliability. Now, you always have to remember with any transport system, People will always prioritize reliability over speed. So if you can get somewhere consistently 7 days a week, you are going to go through that location because it helps you to be reliable. Now, in the case of the Tom Adams, we will see how that particular roundabout scores in a moment. Then there's access and connectivity. This is important because this roundabout distributes us all across Barbados, so it will likely score very high in that particular metric. And then finally, there is the climate resilience and the environmental factors. How does it respond when it rains heavily? Does it flood? Are there any issues in terms of heat or any of the other climate metrics that we will want to consider on a piece of transport infrastructure? So that being the case, this is how I have scored it. .6 out of 5. Now, you might not necessarily agree, but this is a subjective assessment, but an important one because you've got to think about the resilience of transport systems and junctions when we are having a deep dive conversation. Look, let's bring this home. The roundabout works, and we recognize that it's carrying a different mix of traffic: local traffic, airport traffic, and long distance traffic. And that is never a good mix. So whilst we can look at this and assess it, the important thing is what it feels like for you. And places like this actually matter because how we manage these locations today will actually shape the Barbados of tomorrow. And as I've tried to show in my storytelling, look, every journey matters. When people are caught in a transport network, everybody sees everybody. But the reality is we are all there for different purposes. And that's what makes traffic interesting, but that's also what makes it very complicated because we have to unpick those journeys to really provide a network for people that will satisfy so many different uses and purposes. The next time that you are driving around by the airport and you happen to hit the Tom Adams, I hope that you'll remember this and have a look around, see what you think, see how it works for you. I hope you've enjoyed being on this deep dive with me, Mark, the transport guy, and let me know in the comments what it feels like for you if you've been through the Tom Adams, and also if there's a location that you would like me to have a look at. I look forward to it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.